I believe I will die in this Airbnb. I don't know where my friends are, and I don't even know where I am. None of us could have afforded this alone. Even with the 5 of us, it was expensive. But honestly, it was a pretty impressive house. It had 3 stories with dark shingle siding. Paul grew up in the area and found the place. As a child, he'd heard all sorts of stories about the house allegedly being haunted and its dark history, but back then, it wasn't open to the public. So when we chose this town as our destination for our friend's vacation, he immediately jumped at the opportunity to stay here. I was curious, but the prospect of staying in a haunted place excited me much less than my friends. From the moment we entered the house, Ida and I both seemed to feel a mood that unsettled us. While Katie, Diane, and Paul excitedly moved from room to room, we both stayed back, closer to the front door. The house was beautiful, yes, but in a gloomy, menacing way. The dark wood and stained glass windows let in very little light, even during the brightest hours of the day. The old floorboards protested under the steps of our friends as they explored the house. A door next to the kitchen caught my attention, and I suddenly felt drawn to it. Behind it was a staircase. It was narrow and incredibly steep. You could only see a few steps before they disappeared from our view. It looked old and, to be honest, quite terrifying. "Hey, want to join the tour?" Paul called to us. Paul showed us around like an expert, sharing trivia about the house, even though he claimed never to have been there before. He spoke about the place as if it were an old friend. Paul was the newest in our friend group, and I'd only known him for a few months, but I'd never seen him so excited. He was almost overconfident. The house was large enough that each of us could have our own room. I wasn't exactly thrilled about that. The last thing I needed with my overactive imagination was a huge room all to myself. Just as my eyes began to close that night, I thought I heard something moving on the floor above me. It sounded like something large and wet being dragged across the floor. No, not dragged, it was crawling. Through the ventilation grate in the wall, I could hear a faint, whining sigh. I turned on my phone and played music to drown out the sound. Now it sounded like it was groaning. I turned the music louder, pulled the blanket over my head, and pushed the headphones so deep into my ears that I was probably causing future hearing damage. If you can't hear it, it can't hurt you, right? Somehow, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I asked the others if they had experienced anything unusual, but it was just me. Paul was excited and asked many questions. He really hoped the house was haunted. I just told him I'd heard footsteps. That sounded less crazy than saying I'd heard something crawling and wailing in the night. He looked at me with a mischievous smile, almost as if he knew I was lying. We spent the day in town and had a great time. Katie asked the locals about the house we were staying in. An elderly man in a small ice cream parlor we visited told us he thought it was irresponsible and dangerous to rent out the house after what had happened there. It turned out a series of tragedies had taken place there, from the last owners before our Airbnb host to incidents dating back almost 200 years. The man mentioned he believed that enough suffering could open a door and let something in. "Do you think it's haunted here?" Diane asked, her big green eyes hanging on the man's lips. "Well, I always thought haunted meant a person died but never truly left," he said, scratching his chin. He leaned forward as if for dramatic effect and added, "But I don't think what walks these halls was ever human." His words hung over me like a dark cloud for the rest of the day. The noises from upstairs continued on the second night. The wet slapping followed by slow grinding noises and screams above me made me sick. I mentally named whatever was making these sounds the creeper and immediately regretted it because giving it a name didn't make my fear any easier. I turned on music again. At midnight, I woke up as the album had ended, but fortunately so had the disturbing noises from upstairs. I heard voices from the living room area and thought I'd check if my friends were also being kept awake, but no one was there. It wasn't as if I had just missed them in this house. The creaking floorboards would have betrayed their movement. I tried to silently glide back into my room. My socks slid over the smooth wooden floor. Not long after I closed the door, someone gently knocked on my door with their knuckles. It was as if they had been a few steps behind me the whole time, but why hadn't I heard them? "May I come in?" Katie whispered. I was so relieved. The house was really getting to me, and I was grateful for company. Before I could even answer, she repeated it in a sing-song, almost childish voice. "May I come in? I want to show you something." She called my name, but it sounded like she was struggling to pronounce it, almost as if she had never said it before. I froze. Sure, my name might not be too common here, but we had known each other for a decade, and she had always pronounced it effortlessly. When I didn't respond, it sounded like she was scratching at the door, making a sound reminiscent of a mispronunciation. I switched on all the lights in the room and spent the rest of the sleepless night contemplating how to tell my friends that I wouldn't spend another night here. I would, of course, pay my share, but I would stay in a hotel in town tomorrow night. I would have to use some of my savings, but it was worth it. The next morning, Paul stared at me as if hypnotized. "Hey," he leaned towards me. "What was wrong with you last night? You came to my door. You kept trying to lure me into the basement, remember?" I had never gone to Paul's room. I was too busy with my own problems. Ida and Diane had similar stories when they came down. Someone from us had come to their doors and said something like, "Have you seen the basement yet? Let me show you," and tried to lead them there. None of us had opened the door. Diane, because she was too tired and not in the mood to chat. Paul, because he didn't know me that well and thought I was acting strange. Ida, like me, felt that the visitor at her door was not one of us. Paul and Diane were quite excited by this confirmation that our Airbnb was haunted. Ida, on the other hand, stared at me with a grim expression. As for Katie, she didn't come down for breakfast at all. We had plans, and when Katie still hadn't come down by noon, I volunteered to check on her. I went up the stairs, taking in the unique features of the house. Instead of an open atrium on the third floor, there was a beautiful stained glass window placed horizontally on the roof. Parallel to it was a skylight through which sunlight fell, casting splashes of red and purple onto the floor below. I had never seen anything like it. It probably won't surprise you, but Katie wasn't in her room. I heard footsteps above me on the third floor. In daylight, I was much braver. So I climbed the second flight of stairs. I went through room after room on the third floor, but no one was there. Yet it was cold, much colder than on the second or first floor. I went back to the second floor, trying to resist the urge to look over my shoulder. I stopped in front of the door to the room above mine, the room from which I had heard the crawling and wailing noises for the past 2 nights. For a moment, I deliberated, then decided to open the door. It was locked. A part of me was relieved. While I was upstairs, our friends had checked the grounds. The only places they hadn't searched were the basement and the staircase in the kitchen leading to an unknown room. We met in the kitchen, staring at the dark, steep stairs. Paul said he would check the basement if one of us would take the stairs in the kitchen. The cramped space made him nervous, he said. It seemed like a fair trade. After a moment of awkward silence, Diane volunteered. Much to my immense relief, she was the smallest of us, only 5 feet tall. Even then, she had to crawl on her hands and knees to get up the stairs. We waited below, listening to her moving around upstairs. She called for Katie. It sounded like the room was huge. My stomach churned as I realized I heard 2 sets of footsteps, one directly above my head and another further into the kitchen, approaching the person above me. Diane. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. No answer. I took a deep breath, preparing to follow her. As I had crawled about 3 steps up, something moved to the top of the stairs, blocking the already limited light. I screamed and jumped backward, almost hitting my head on the doorframe. Instinctively, I stood behind the tallest person in the kitchen, Ida, who was a few inches taller than me. Diane eventually reappeared. She walked like a normal human on two legs. Perhaps I had only imagined what I saw in the dark. Well, Paul asked, was Katie up there? Diane cracked her neck on both sides, stared at us, and smiled as if she was seeing our faces for the first time. Slowly, she shook her head. She gave me a different smile than the others and winked at me. She smelled of old, stale things, looked disheveled, and moved stiffly. We continued our search, but the problem was there was no door to the basement that we could find. Ida sent a message to the host. We all worded it together, hoping it sounded inconspicuous. We asked where the basement was. The answer came immediately. There is no basement. Paul laughed nervously, and Diane smiled dreamily as she looked up at the stained glass skylight. It was as if she had been in her own world since her exploration of the small room in the kitchen. Ida and I exchanged nervous glances. We went into town to see if anyone had seen Katie and spent the rest of the day looking for her. When we returned to the house in the evening, we sat in silence in the large living room. Without Katie, the room felt much emptier. We stared at a pizza that none of us wanted to eat. It seemed I would have to spend another night here after all. I locked the door to my room, and at the usual time, heard the wet, crawling noises from upstairs again. I tried not to imagine what the thing making those noises might look like. At home, I always slept under a heavy blanket that made me feel safe. Here, I only had a thin sheet and an old blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling of being unprotected. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. Outside my door, I heard groaning and scratching. "I need your help." The voice was deep but sounded feminine. It wasn't Ida. It wasn't Katie. It didn't even sound like Diane. "It's me." "Diane," the voice said. I didn't answer. The tone was strange, almost unnatural. The doorknob turned quickly and aggressively. I remained still and motionless. "I need your help. My skin, it's too tight. It doesn't fit." I sat upright, leaning against the headboard, hands over my mouth, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The pounding on the door continued until the footsteps slowly faded away. The next morning, Ida looked happy, almost radiant. I noticed she looked different. Ida usually wore perfectly applied cat eyeliner and her signature purple lipstick, but this morning she had no makeup. Her blue-black hair looked strange. Her usually carefully styled bangs, which always ended in a delicate point between her eyebrows, were hastily combed to the side. I had always admired her presentation and wished I had her patience and skill. She didn't look bad this morning, but she didn't look like herself. Neither Diane nor Paul came down for breakfast. "I'll go look for the others," I whispered. "You should check up there." Ida rasped in the same rough, unfamiliar voice I'd heard outside my door the night before. She pointed to the stairs in the kitchen. My throat tightened. I quickly shook my head. She responded with a smile. I had half expected her to pounce on me or follow me on my search for Paul and Diane, but she didn't. Instead, she cooked, again going up the narrow, nightmarish stairs, displaying the same unnaturally proportioned dexterity Diane had demonstrated the day before. I nervously knocked on Paul's door. It was also locked. I kept knocking until he opened the door, sleepy and slightly annoyed by the interruption. He blocked the view into his room with his body. When I told him I couldn't find Diane, he said he would meet me downstairs. Diane was nowhere to be found. Ida had not yet returned from the room above the kitchen. I could hear the ripping and wet chewing sounds from upstairs. Without a word, I closed the door, fighting the nausea that was rising in me. I tried to convince Paul that we had to leave in daylight. I didn't want to leave our friends behind, but we had to come back with more people because something terrible was happening here. We were outnumbered, probably even numerically. Paul tried to persuade me to stay. There must be an explanation. We can't just take the car and leave our friends here. He looked at me reproachfully. I loved our friends just as much, but I couldn't spend another night in this house. I thought of the creeper upstairs behind the locked door, dragging its heavy body across the floor like wet meat, crying in the darkness. I thought of Diane's strange behavior and her subsequent disappearance. I thought of Katie, who had heard the voice outside her door and followed it. I thought of the thing, presumably wearing skin, doing something messy upstairs, and I wondered if Paul and I were the only ones who were normal. I told him while packing my things when I suddenly felt a sharp blow and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in the basement. It turned out there was a basement. Katie was there too. She seemed to be nailed to the wall by her wrists. Her eyes were glassy, staring motionless and pale straight ahead. "Katie," I whispered to her. She weakly turned her head towards me. She was still wearing the same clothes as 2 days ago, with streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. I was just relieved she was still alive. I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Paul. He was carrying a cooler and a bag full of tools. Never had I been less happy to see someone. He came, squatted in front of me, and ruffled my head as if I were a pet. He smiled brightly. "You're awake. Great. We have more mouths to feed." He rubbed his hands together, almost gleefully, and in his eyes there was a madness that sent chills down my spine. Despite all the terrifying things I had experienced in this house, the realization that Paul was part of it all was 10 times worse. The last spark of hope I had extinguished at that moment. While he rummaged in the bag, choosing a long, sharp tool, I moved cautiously, positioning my legs under him. As Paul approached me, I jumped up and ran in his direction, hitting him hard with my shoulder. It seemed to surprise him, and I took advantage of his confusion. I snatched the cooler and swung it with the one hand I could still move freely. It hit him with a dull thud, and he fell backward. I turned to Katie. Now I could see her legs. It looked as if something had gnawed at them. Through her torn jeans, I could see bones protruding under the skin. I knew I couldn't move her in her condition. I would have to come back for her later. I ran up the stairs, and my heart sank when I saw that I was in a part of the house I had never seen before. It looked older, and the careful restoration that had been done in the other parts of the house was completely absent here. I wondered which of the many doors would lead out, but the fact that one of the doors was boarded up shattered my hope and answered my question at the same time. I limped through the dusty hallway. My leg felt numb and heavy. Finally, I found a room through whose small windows a little light fell. I locked the door behind me and sank exhausted against the wall. I called the police. All I could do now was wait and hope they would find me here before Paul or any of the other inhabitants did. Alternatively, I would try to open one of the sealed windows if I had the opportunity. The minutes dragged like hours as I waited for any sign of rescue. I listened for sounds, my nerves stretched taut. Footsteps echoed through the corridor, and my fear grew with each approaching sound. The silence was almost as bad as the noises. It left room for the worst imaginings in my head. What had happened to Katie? What about Diane and Ida? Were they even themselves anymore? I don't know how long I sat in the small room waiting, but every moving shadow made me flinch. Eventually, I heard the distant sound of sirens. My hope returned, albeit hesitantly, but at the same time. I also heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. My heart began to pound. I couldn't be sure if it was the police or Paul coming back to finish his work. The door behind which I was hiding began to move slowly. Someone was trying to open the door, but the lock held. I pressed myself against the wall, the kitchen knife held tightly in my hand. The footsteps stopped, and the doorknob stopped moving. I heard someone take a deep breath before the footsteps slowly led away again. I barely dared to breathe, my heart beating so violently I thought it might shake the door. After a while, I heard the sirens growing louder. I stood up, trembling, and carefully moved to the window. Through a crack, I could see rays of light, blue lights. It was the police. They were finally here. I knocked violently against the window, screaming with all my remaining strength, "Here, I'm in here." Shortly after, I heard voices outside the house. Footsteps approached. Someone called. "Police, is anyone here?" I answered as loudly as I could, "Yes, please help me." The door was broken open and two police officers stormed in, their flashlights blinding me, but I immediately felt safer. "Are you hurt?" one of them asked. I nodded weakly and pointed to my leg. They carefully led me out of the room and outside. The fresh air hit my face and I began to cry from relief and fear. As the police continued into the house, I heard radio chatter. "We found another person in the basement." I recognized the voice of one of the officers. Katie. They had found Katie, but she wasn't the Katie I knew. Her injuries were severe, her condition critical, and she was immediately taken to the hospital. Diane and Ida remained missing, as did Paul. While I was being brought to safety, I could hardly process what had happened. Everything seemed like a nightmare, but the screams and noises I had heard in the house were too real to be merely products of my imagination. Katie survived, but she was not the same. She never spoke about what had happened to her and avoided all contact with us. Diane and Ida were officially reported missing. The police continued their investigation, but found no further clues. Paul was never found. It was assumed he had fled, but a part of me believed he had never really been just Paul. Perhaps he was something that had always existed in that house, a part of the horror that lived there. I withdrew from the town, cut contact with the others, and tried to leave the events behind me. But even on the quietest nights, I sometimes hear the dragging, wet sound of something crawling, and then I wonder if what we left in that house will ever truly let us go. I'm keeping some of these details vague because I really don't want the host to find out I've published this story. I don't think they'd approve. I hope that's okay, and I'll try to make it as comprehensive as possible. I recently spent a year studying in Mexico, and as one does on an exchange, I tried to travel as much as possible. There was a big break between semesters, and my best friend, with whom I spent most of my time during the exchange, and I decided to go on a longer backpacking trip through Mexico. We had a rough plan of where we wanted to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our return flight, let alone decided from where we would take it. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had a great time, and a few days before the end of our trip, we finally decided we would take our flight from a nearby city that had really cheap flights. The city itself, however, didn't really have anything to offer. On Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool, and we thought we could just treat ourselves to a relaxing pool day at the end of the trip. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican, the wife was from Europe and could even speak our native language. We arranged to take the bus to the airport, and they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived in the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to take us to the airport as it was not directly on his route, so he just dropped us off on the highway. That was a pretty messed up situation from the start, standing on the roadside in the middle of nowhere in a not-so-safe city in Mexico with our backpacks. I called the hostess and sent her our GPS location. She said, no problem, they would pick us up. The husband came to pick us up, and it was a very uncomfortable situation. Sitting in a strange car in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache. I tried to make small talk with him, but he only gave monosyllabic answers or ignored me completely. Well, he's just not much of a talker, I thought, hoping we would arrive soon. In retrospect, I see a million red flags, but for some reason, we just didn't see them at the time. Maybe we were too tired. Or frankly, we had no other choice but to go along with it. But yes, we drove, and that should have immediately alarmed us. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields with sheep and goats, when suddenly a dirt road branched off from the paved road. Along this dirt road, there were about 6 huge villas, all with 2-meter-high walls, barbed wire on top, huge gates, and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we entered their house, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly, communicative, middle-aged woman who was very talkative but pleasant. She had actually cooked for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table and didn't say a single word. After dinner, we more or less went straight to bed as it was late and we were exhausted from a long day. The next morning, we found that the weather wasn't so good. So we decided to go to town and see some tourist attractions instead of spending the day by the pool. When we got back, it was already dark, but we decided to jump into the pool anyway to cool off because it was really hot and humid. The hostess joined us, and at some point, my friend made the mistake of asking how they could afford such a house. It didn't really fit the price range of the professions they had told us. She hedged and added that her husband was very skilled as he had grown up on the streets and basically built the house himself. We realized it might not be a good topic and changed the conversation. This was the last day of our trip, and we had an early morning flight home. We had some weed left over that we had brought on the trip and thought it would be nice to smoke a joint as it was our last night. However, as it was a family home and there were children in the house, we thought it would be better to ask the hosts if they minded. Later that evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked on the property, which she found quite amusing for some reason. She started laughing and called out to her husband, who was sitting on the couch watching TV. "Honey, the boys are asking if it would be okay if they smoked some weed. What do you think?" He just laughed but didn't answer. He looked at her with a bewildered expression while she told us, "Sure, just do it." So we went out to the terrace and started smoking our joint. Later, the hosts joined us and we just chatted, and this is where it got really crazy. For some reason, they started asking all sorts of questions about the weed, where we got it, how much it cost, who we bought it from, and how much we would pay for it in Europe. They seemed far too interested in the weed, and at some point the wife casually revealed, "Yes, we've thought about making that a source of income, selling weed, but too many people die doing that because the cartels don't like it. In fact, my husband has killed people for doing that." I was immediately sober. Had she just said that? And as if he had read my thoughts, her husband added, "Yes, when I was about 16, I killed many people for the cartel for money." And he said it in a tone of voice as if he had mowed lawns as a teenager. I still thought I had misheard. So I sent a message to my friend sitting opposite me while trying not to make eye contact because I knew we would freak each other out. He confirmed that I had indeed understood correctly. We discussed what to do and agreed that there was no immediate danger and that we should just stay. We had nowhere else to go anyway, and it was late. But things got even crazier. We tried to keep our composure and not freak out completely while continuing to chat with our hosts. A few minutes later, the man got up and went inside to get something. He came back with a literal kilo of weed pressed into a brick. He began to break off pieces of the brick and roll a joint that would probably have knocked Snoop Dogg off his socks. The joint was about the size of my thumb, and I estimate there were about 2 grams of weed in it. Of course. He offered us the joint, but we politely declined, saying we were already pretty high. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately he accepted our excuse, but it got even worse. A few minutes later, we heard a few loud bangs. The woman became a little uneasy and asked, "What was that?" The man calmly replied, 9mm. With that, he confirmed my suspicion that they had indeed been gunshots. There were about 7 shots fired in quick succession. The woman became nervous and asked if maybe we should go inside. "What do you think they are shooting at?" "In the air, at cows, at people." But he just shrugged and we stayed outside. A few minutes later, there were more shots, this time even closer. The woman became even more nervous and asked again, "Should we go inside? What do you think they're shooting at? We have to go inside." I don't know why. But the way he said that so calmly scared the hell out of me and still makes my heart beat faster when I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. Finally, we could talk to each other and we completely lost it. We panicked. What the hell should we do? We were trapped in a hitman's house in the middle of nowhere. There was shooting outside. We decided it was probably best to stay because we thought, well, we're his guests, and he won't do anything to us. It's better to stay calm and enjoy ourselves. So we barricaded ourselves in our room and didn't sleep a wink all night. In the morning, we left as quickly as possible and drove to the airport. I have never been so happy to be searched at security as I was at that moment. My friend Josh and I saved up some extra money so we could book an Airbnb for a weekend that we had been looking at for over 6 months. It was in Portland, Oregon, and it was insanely expensive, but we thought it would be worth every penny. After all, it was exactly what we needed, a perfect getaway. We could finally get away from work, away from all the unnecessary drama, just the two of us, best friends in a cabin in the woods off any roads, with access to a private lake and lots of privacy, or so we thought. We drove my van from Maryland and took everything we could possibly fit. I mean, we probably couldn't have fit another box if we had tried. It was a nice drive anyway. I love road trips, and it was only about an hour-and-a-half drive, so not too bad. When we arrived, it was just afternoon, so we quickly unpacked everything and had lunch, just a few sandwiches and chips. We discussed what we wanted to do for the day. I told Josh that I was really looking forward to taking the boat out for a bit of a ride and maybe some fishing. We got out the camping chairs and sat outside on the small porch we had for a while. We just took everything in, relaxed. It was so nice. I still remember how happy and excited I was. A little later, we got our drinks, put on our swimsuits, brought snacks, fishing gear, and a few other things so we could enjoy our day on the water. We actually both caught a bass and were pretty happy about it, so we decided to take a spin. We spent about 20 minutes zooming across the lake. However, we wanted to get back soon to get ready for dinner and figure out what else we wanted to do while we still had some daylight. Now, to be clear, in the cabin we were staying in, there were no other cabins, people, or anything of that sort for at least a mile in any direction as far as we knew. So we had all the freedom to do and leave what we wanted and could be as loud as we wanted. It was truly so beautiful. We were surrounded by trees and nature. It was pure bliss. Right in front of our cabin, a long path led to the lake, a scene straight out of a movie. Anyway, it got late. After dinner, we decided to sit by the fire for a bit. We stayed outside for a couple of hours, drank a few beers, and so on. It had been a long day, so we were pretty tired by about 11 p.m. We had both gotten up very early, had a long drive, and had been in the sun all day. Plus, I had only slept a few hours the night before, so we both went to bed. We were just quickly tidying up outside before going to bed, and at that very moment, I saw something. I saw a large, shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye. What the hell? I thought to myself. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to see it better, but when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. That was very strange, but we were in the woods, so I convinced myself it could have been something harmless. Nevertheless, I had a bad feeling, to be honest. I didn't tell Josh because I didn't want to seem like a scared wimp or crazy. Maybe I should have told him, though, and I wish I had gotten a better look at it the first time. Maybe then we could have reacted a little earlier instead of being woken up in the night by an ominous, light knock on the front door. Josh was fast asleep, but I heard it immediately. I'm a light sleeper and was totally on edge. "Josh, wake up," I whispered. He was in a dreamlike state but woke up pretty quickly, an old, deep knock on our door. He went straight to the door as if he was about to open it. "Are you crazy? Don't open the door," I whispered. How I wish he had realized that this was a huge red flag. We were a mile into the woods on private property. It made no sense for anyone to be there, not even a tiny bit. Knock, 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 now louder. "Hello," the man called from behind the door. Unfortunately, we couldn't see him properly through the window because he was standing in a spot that blocked our view. He was somehow in a blind spot. Then he started pounding violently on the door without words, but still very aggressively. "Dude, get lost now, go away. I don't care what you want or who you are, get lost, stop provoking me." Josh. This was really strange because the guy just kept knocking and didn't say anything. "I don't know, but that sounds like a serial killer," I said. I didn't know then, but apparently Josh had a gun license, which meant he was legally allowed to carry a weapon. He drew the gun and slowly opened the door. But he didn't have it pointed at us yet. We both stepped back a few steps as he opened the door. The man stood there, staring at us. He had a black ski mask on, a full camouflage outfit, and gloves. He was probably about 6'3". The man saw Josh had a gun and immediately ran away. Josh followed him for a bit, shouting at him not to come back or next time he wouldn't be able to run away. I started to panic a bit. Dude, that guy was totally insane. What the hell was that? He could hardly believe what had just happened. I don't know if he was after someone he thought was alone, if he wanted to rob us, or if he just wanted to scare us. Who knew what he wanted? Anyway, we decided to stay for the rest of our time at the Airbnb because we had already paid for it and didn't want some idiot to ruin our vacation. We didn't think he would come back. I mean, it wouldn't be very smart of him to do that. We enjoyed the rest of the time there, albeit a bit more nervously than usual, but he never came back. My husband and I travel often and have preferred staying in Airbnbs rather than hotels. It's cozier, more unique, and offers a more personalized experience, which we used to really like because instead of checking in with a soulless hotel employee, you have an actual conversation with the host as a human being. However, our last stay in an Airbnb will probably be our last. My husband and I had stayed in this particular Airbnb twice before, and we really liked it. The decor was very warm and suitable for, let's say, romantic adventures. We booked this Airbnb, which was half of a duplex, when we traveled to San Francisco to visit old friends who lived in a really nice area outside the Bay Area. We spent a lot of time with these friends, but we loved having a place where we could spend some alone time together that didn't feel like an ordinary, stale hotel. We also started to become friends with the host. He's a single man, about 35 years old, who lives alone with his cats. My husband and I always noticed how enthusiastic he was to host us. He invited us to breakfast every morning on his side of the house, which we usually accepted because he was surprisingly good at cooking. It was a bit strange eating with him, however, as he sometimes asked many questions. Most weren't really odd, but some were quite personal. For example, he asked us how long we had been married, if we planned to have children, emphasizing that he phrased it exactly as making children. Then he asked if we had ever practiced the lessons of the Kama Sutra, if we wanted tips or advice, or even needed help with changes in the bedroom. At this point, my husband would usually give him a few stern words. There was almost always an awkward silence, but we endured it because there was good, free food. When the mood was tense, I tried to lighten it with a joke. Once, when the host asked us about our bedroom fertility, I tried to proudly explain that we had definitely covered all the bases to our liking. I hoped it would be a funny deflection of the topic, but it backfired. He started laughing hysterically, far too intensely. He even had trouble speaking, but eventually managed to get something out that sounded like, "Oh, I know that." The insinuation of a privacy violation really angered my husband, who abruptly stood up from his chair and yelled at the host to explain exactly what he meant by that. The host immediately stopped laughing and stared into the air for a few seconds before finally admitting that he had heard us through the wall making love the other night. My husband and I can be loud, so we more or less had to accept that explanation. This happened the second time we stayed there. The third time we flew to visit our friends, we discussed where we wanted to stay, and my husband brought up all the strange things the host had said and suggested we might want to go somewhere else. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any other accommodation that was as good, affordable, and in the right location, so we decided to go with it again. No sooner had we made the booking than the host messaged us through the Airbnb app, showing excessive enthusiasm, saying he loved us and was so happy we had chosen him again. I rolled my eyes and said, "Great. Here we go again," but at that point, it was still a little bit funny. When we arrived, the host tried to treat us like servants. However, we were late because our flight was delayed, so we were very tired and asked to be left alone for the night. The host seemed sad for a moment, but as he turned, he couldn't hide a smile that spread across his face. My husband hadn't seen it, but I had. I was about to tell him when I was distracted because he went into the bedroom. We immediately noticed that it was somehow different, as if things had been rearranged since we were last there. We talked about it for a few minutes, but I didn't think much of it, nor did my husband. We probably would have fallen asleep in a few minutes if we hadn't noticed that we hadn't slept together in the last few days after getting into bed. Just thinking about it and being back in that room got us in the mood. I won't go into detail, but the short version is that there was a lamp on the bedside table that hadn't been there before, and because we weren't used to it being there, and in our excitement, we knocked it over. It shattered when it fell to the floor, which made us stop cleaning up. As my husband cleaned up the mess, he uncovered something in the pile of broken ceramic that at first glance looked like a button, a spy camera. My reaction was as if I was going to be sick, but I have never seen my husband's face flush so quickly and so intensely with anger. He got dressed, stormed out of the room, and broke down the door to enter the host's side of the house. I didn't follow him, but I listened. My husband threatened to kill him if he didn't explain himself. This was followed by a prolonged, heated interrogation that I didn't quite catch, but what my husband told me was that after some crocodile tears, he got the host to admit that he had been watching us in the bedroom the whole time, and he had just installed new cameras when he knew we were coming back. We tried to get him to delete all the footage, but the worst part was that it was far too late to do that because the host was such a perverted creep that he had published the footage he had of us on several porn websites, which means there's no way of knowing how many people have seen us in our private time. There's practically no way to completely delete the footage if other people have already downloaded it. Unfortunately, this experience has ruined more than just our vacation with friends, and we are just now in the process of taking legal action. Otherwise, I would be much more open to revealing every little detail to get revenge, but I'd rather see him rot in jail, so I'll do it the right way and remain anonymous. I have often rented apartments through Airbnb. On the whole, I never had major problems, so I never really questioned the booking before accepting it. However, if I ever decide to host on Airbnb again, that would be one thing I would change, the way I deal with guests. It was probably only a matter of time until I had an experience with a guest that was so disturbed and so absolutely disruptive that I had to give up hosting, just to never be confronted with anything like it again. The guest in this story was a man I will call Kale. He was a single man in his early 30s who wanted to stay for a week. He didn't say he was traveling or anything like that, but he said he urgently needed a place to stay, which was a little unusual, but I didn't think much of it. When I met him upon his arrival, he didn't have much luggage either, just a duffel bag, a backpack, and a broken bicycle. I could immediately tell that he was in a difficult situation, maybe even homeless, which made me wonder how he could afford the stay. He looked like he hadn't showered or taken care of himself in weeks, and overall, he seemed quite nervous. Nevertheless, he wasn't rude at this point. On the contrary, he was actually very friendly and grateful. Despite his appearance, I treated him no differently than other guests. After giving him the usual tour, I left him alone and told him to just relax, as I would with anyone else. Unfortunately, as the days went by, it turned out that Kale would become problematic. I could constantly hear loud music coming from the apartment, and no matter how many times I messaged him to ask him to turn it down, he never did. When I knocked on the door to tell him in person, I could see his shadow inside and heard him frantically rummaging through things, as if trying to hide something. But he didn't open the door. I considered going in with my own key but decided against it. It really started to bother me more than anything else since I had never had to do that before. The first warning sign that I should have taken more seriously was the smell coming from the door. It smelled like burning plastic or something. At that point, I had no idea where this stench was coming from, but later it became very clear what he was doing in there and what was causing it. I should have kicked him out much earlier, but after several days I thought to myself, I'll just let him stay until the end of his booking since it wasn't much longer. After he had stayed there for a week, it was finally time for him to leave. Usually, guests simply leave when it's time to check out, and I was grateful not to have to see him again. I was also glad that the loud music had finally stopped, but I was nervous to see how bad the apartment would look after him. But I still had to go in and check because I was the one who had to clean it up, and let me tell you, I was horrified. The entire apartment was ravaged. All the furniture was crazily rearranged. Trash was everywhere. There was food on almost every surface in the kitchen, and one of the pots was completely ruined because it was covered in a white substance that I couldn't identify for the life of me. The whole apartment also stank. I didn't even want to know what the bathroom looked like. When I went there, the door was strangely locked. Annoyed, I went back to my house for a moment and got a hairpin to open the door, but when I came back, the bathroom door was open. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and suddenly I was very tense. Just at that moment, I heard a noise from the kitchen that made my heart drop. It was glass breaking. I crept down the hallway, stopped at the corner, and carefully peeked around the doorframe to see what was going on. I saw Kale standing there with a broken bottle in one hand and a metal baseball bat in the other. When I looked into his eyes, I could immediately tell that he was high on something and that he completely freaked out at the sight of me and started yelling at me. "Who are you? Get out of my house. Don't mess with me. I swear to God I'll kill you." I started backing towards the door, trying to calmly explain myself. "Kale, it's me, the host. I allowed you to stay here, remember?" "I don't remember you. Don't try to trick me," he said. "I'm not lying, I swear. Look, let's just talk about it. Can you put all that down?" Thereupon, he immediately started yelling at me again, saying over and over, "Shut up." Then Kale rushed towards me, turned abruptly, and ran straight out the door with a bang. But just as I was turning the corner, I felt a glass bottle smash into my back and break, injuring me pretty badly. I kept running until I was finally safe. I went back into my house, locked the door, and immediately called the police. I'm sure the standoff between Kale and the police is a whole other story, but unfortunately I missed most of it. What I saw was them coming with 4 or 5 officers and carrying Kale out of the apartment, hands and feet bound in handcuffs and covered in blood, screaming. I later learned that Kale had been smoking crack the entire time he was in my garage apartment and was so completely wasted that he forgot he was just a guest who was supposed to leave after a week. Since then, I've had an uncomfortable feeling every time I thought about housing another stranger on my property, so I canceled all my bookings and deleted my account. I don't think I'll try my luck with Airbnb again. Four years ago, I rented an Airbnb for the holidays. I was visiting my family for Christmas week and was looking for accommodation just a few miles away. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I expected. It was a perfectly normal house in a perfectly normal neighborhood. Overall, I was satisfied. I arrived around 6 p.m. on that first day, and didn't feel like going out immediately to see. So I stayed home and relaxed for the rest of the evening. I watched some TV and even did a bit of work. I went to bed just before 10 p.m. and fell asleep, but in the middle of the night, I slowly woke up to a noise from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even look at the clock, but it sounded like a few small noises bouncing off the wall from somewhere in the house. As I listened to the noises, I didn't really feel worried or anything, but just thought the house was making these noises. I stayed awake for only a minute before falling back asleep, and I don't remember waking up again that night. In the morning, I had already forgotten about it and didn't think about the noises I had heard. I was pretty sure it was just the air conditioning or something. Anyway, I let my family know I had arrived in town, and we made plans for dinner at their place. I relaxed all morning and afternoon at the Airbnb until I was ready to leave. I grabbed my bag and keys and went to the front door to leave the house. But as I opened the door, I suddenly found myself face to face with a man standing right in front of me on the porch. It completely caught me off guard, and I just stood there staring at him for a second before I even said anything. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man had neither rung the doorbell nor knocked on the door, which made me wonder how long he had been standing there and why he was there at all. He didn't answer my question, but just nodded and then walked away. I watched him walk down the street until he finally disappeared. I can't imagine a scenario where that wouldn't be strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb, and how long had he been standing there without knocking? I made sure the house was locked and then drove to my parents for dinner. I told them about the situation, and everyone found it just as creepy as I did. Dinner was nice anyway, and we had many good conversations catching up on life, but all night long, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and whether my things I had left at the Airbnb would be stolen or something. I left dinner around 9 p.m. and was back at the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway and went to the front door, looking for obvious signs that someone had been there in my absence. But I saw nothing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I walked down the hall to the end and into the kitchen, where I placed my keys and bag on the counter. But then there was suddenly a dull thud. It was exactly like the noises I had heard last night, but now that I was downstairs, it was much louder and clearly coming from one side of the house. I slowly stepped into the room where the sound was coming from, but then the thud came again, this time from a door right next to me. I jumped back, got a rush of adrenaline, and after staring at the door for a few seconds, I could hear the faint sound of heavy breathing on the other side. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car. I still didn't know exactly what was going on, but I didn't want to stay to find out alone. I called 911 and waited for their arrival. When they finally arrived, I watched them search the house. After a few minutes, they came out and told me something horrifying. The door behind which the person was showed signs of abuse, as the person had probably tried to pick the lock and get in. Unbeknownst to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, which had not been locked by whoever was there before me. I never intended to use the garage, so I never checked it. Whether the man I saw on the porch was the same person in the garage is unknown. But just the thought of me sleeping while someone was trying to break into the house directly below me is terrifying. What did they want to achieve after breaking in? We don't know, of course. Anyway, I stayed in a hotel for the rest of the week after that, but I find that I still often think about this situation, even after 4 years. In 2018, my 3 other friends and I, all men in our early 20s, decided to travel to Bali for a week. It was cheap, we had time, so we thought, why not? Our itinerary included sightseeing, trying local foods, mountain climbing, visiting beach bars, basically a typical vacation in Indonesia. It was honestly a pretty surreal experience. The country is absolutely beautiful, and the food was amazing. The only problem I had with the trip was the locals. Drugs were really prevalent there, especially mushrooms. The streets were full of dealers trying to sell us their drugs. I'm not exaggerating when I say that one guy even grabbed my arm because I ignored his two for the price of one offer for a one-way trip to meet Jesus. I shook him off while my friends laughed and suggested I might be missing the chance to meet our Lord and Savior. The guy looked frantic and desperate, as if he was about to attack me like a rabid dog at any moment. I wasn't too scared, as we were confident we could handle them since half of them weren't even sober. Yet that was just the tip of the iceberg. The horror began when we returned to our Airbnb for the night. We had an early day ahead of us the next morning and were exhausted. The place was extremely cheap and didn't even have a proper lock for the door. There were two wooden doors that opened inwards, and the only way to lock them was to put a wooden block through the holes in the door. It was a pretty primitive lock, but I thought it would serve the purpose. Everything went well until the last night of our trip when we noticed that the wooden block was missing. We searched everywhere for it, but to no avail. I just thought that one of us must have misplaced it somewhere. We decided to use a selfie stick instead. I know that sounds like a terrible idea. Since we didn't have anything that fit the holes to lock the door, we went to sleep not expecting anything, as we had already spent 6 days there without problems. I woke up in the middle of the night to strange clicking noises. I got out of my bed, thinking it might be one of the boys, so I approached the sound without much concern. My friends were all asleep, so I decided to investigate the cause of the noises. The noise seemed to be coming from the door, so I went there, completely confused as to who could be at our door at that time. I noticed that the doors were slightly open and the selfie stick was terribly bent. I peeked out and saw 3 people staring through the gap between the doors. They were standing really close to the entrance and trying to open the doors. I yelled at them and asked about their intentions when I noticed that one of them was holding the wooden block. I was shocked and confused by the situation. As I recognized one of the men, he did the general cleaning of the Airbnb and paths during the day, so there was no reason for him to be there at 3 a.m. The other guy asked if the wooden block belonged to us, as they had supposedly found it outside the Airbnb. I immediately smelled lies, as there was absolutely no reason to do this at 3 a.m. I called my friends, and the 3 men immediately ran away. I explained the circumstances to the boys, and we stayed awake until morning in case they tried to do anything again. We decided to inform the reception about their employee, but the description I gave did not match theirs. They said that the cleaning staff they hired were exclusively women in their late 30s to 40s. That sent shivers down our spines as we realized we had let a complete imposter into our room while we were out. Fortunately, nothing important was lost, and we got out of the situation safely, but I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't woken up on that fateful night as the doors were about to be opened. I was just grateful it was our last night there. I was traveling across the country in my car. I had been driving for over a week from the city where I live and had been sleeping in my car so far to save money. It wasn't until I arrived in a big city that I decided to treat myself to a proper, comfortable bed. I opted for Airbnb because it's cheaper than most hotels. I booked this Airbnb a day before I arrived in the city, as there weren't many options left. I found an apartment on Airbnb that looked very new and modern and was in a great location. The price was reasonable for this location and seemed almost too good to be true. The only downside was that it was listed as a new listing and had no reviews. I thought the price was low because it was a new listing and decided to just give it a try. It had to be legitimate, after all, it was Airbnb, right? When I got to the apartment building, It looked older than I expected. I later found out that my Airbnb was probably the only renovated apartment in the building, and the building was in bad shape. It looked more like a student dormitory than an apartment building. Anyway, I let all that go because I hadn't paid much, so what could I expect? The apartment itself looked like the pictures, and that was good enough for me. Everything went well for the first few days. As a woman traveling alone, I always make sure to be safe. I don't go out when it's dark, and I always lock the door, every lock, including the security chain. On the third day, I was out all morning and came back to the apartment to change and go to the beach. I had locked the door again, including the security chain. I was in front of the door, watching TV while getting dressed, when suddenly the door opened, and someone opened it. I was incredibly lucky that I had put on the security chain. Otherwise, the door would have opened all the way. I was naked, and no one but me was supposed to have a key. My first reaction was, "Excuse me," and I immediately locked the door again. I stood behind the door, not seeing who had opened it and not looking outside. I sat in front of the door, startled and shocked, realizing that this person could theoretically still come in, as they obviously had a key to the apartment. At first, I thought it might be the owner coming back after I had checked out, but I wasn't supposed to check out until the next day, so that wasn't possible. After crying for a few minutes, I composed myself and called the owner to tell her what had happened. She told me that no one but her and me was supposed to have a key, that she was at work, and it wasn't her. I was scared to stay in the apartment because someone could come in. But I also didn't want to leave because I had all my valuables there. It was a lose-lose situation. Then I called my father, who said it wasn't okay for someone to have a key and that she needed to take care of it immediately. So we talked to her, and she said she would come soon with a locksmith to change the lock and give me a new set of keys. She told me that she had only owned the apartment for 6 months and that there had only been one other Airbnb booking before my stay. She also mentioned that, apart from these 2 bookings, the apartment had been vacant because it had been renovated. That explained why the building was in a miserable state and didn't match the apartment. She said the only possibility was that it could have been the previous owners or someone connected to them. Isn't that illegal? This possibility or theory really messed with me. How was it possible that I was away all day, every day, and exactly in the 10 minutes I was home during the day, someone tried to come in? Did they know I was there, and what did they want to do here? If this apartment had been vacant for half a year, did they perhaps do this regularly? Or did they see me go in and want to do something with me? These questions keep running through my head. So all I know is that I was lucky to put on the security chain. Otherwise, I don't even want to imagine what could have happened. I will certainly not leave a good review and definitely will not stay in an Airbnb that has no reviews or seems too good to be true again. In the summer of 2019, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver and stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We liked camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different to make the most of our vacation. My partner had never been outside the US, and it seemed like a crazy new adventure. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state. The grand finale being a reserved campsite at Golden Ears near Alouette Lake. We packed poorly, taking a huge tent and lots of fruits and vegetables to eat healthy. We stored everything in a too small cooler and brought a cutting board and knife to prepare snacks during the trip. We started in California and took turns driving in our bright red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington and finally arrived in Vancouver. We spent a day or 2 in each state, drank a bit too much, and stayed up late. Canada was the best part of the trip, and Alouette Lake felt like walking into a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks, our toes in the ice-cold lake water, hiked around, and saw a beautiful waterfall where we watched a couple taking pictures of each other for a full hour. We even bought the same pants from afar. Everything was perfect, and the campsite was empty except for the other couple. We went to bed early. It was quiet, and I woke up to a crackle outside the tent. My partner was still snoring, and I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black and probably an animal. However, the crackling got closer to the tent. I sat up, took my phone, and turned on the light, only to almost blind myself in those 2 seconds. In that brief moment, I recognized a person directly in front of our tent. I froze and sat upright. The person didn't move and was close enough to open the tent. I tried to nudge my partner because I had no idea what to do. She woke up and I said, "There's someone outside the tent." Then I heard footsteps, soft footsteps leaving our campsite. My partner began to mumble loudly and confusedly. What? A car or truck was parked directly in front of our campsite, but no one was visible. The vehicle started and drove away without turning on its lights until it turned a corner and was out of sight. It looked like a truck. Now I was shaking, and my partner couldn't grasp what was happening. I wanted to leave, but at Golden Ears, the gate closes until 4 or 5 a.m., and it was only 1 a.m. We decided to sleep in the Ford Fiesta. My partner fell asleep immediately, thinking I was paranoid. Could it have been a park ranger? The behavior seemed far too strange for a ranger. I sat awake for 2 hours. The car was locked, and I wanted to sleep but couldn't. Around 3 a.m., I heard a car slowly driving down the road without lights. As it rounded the corner, I recognized it had to be the same truck. My adrenaline surged through my body and I panicked. The truck slowly pulled up directly in front of our campsite, in the exact same spot as before. I felt sick with fear. I had no weapon, only the kitchen knife we had brought for fruits and vegetables. I took the knife and tried to appear angry, crazy, and big. I sat bolt upright in the passenger seat, holding the knife at eye level, staring expressionlessly into the darkness at the truck like the father in the American Gothic painting. The truck finally started again, turned on its lights, and drove back the way it had come. My heart was pounding, and I woke my partner up to say that we had to leave immediately. We packed our things by simply throwing them into the car and stayed awake until 6 a.m. Then we drove off and didn't stop. We talked about it the whole time, trying to understand the situation. Finally, we decided that we both desperately needed sleep. A few weeks ago, I went on a trip where I rented an Airbnb townhouse. I was in a small town near some hiking trails I wanted to explore. I had never been there and had no exact idea of the place I would be staying. I just knew it was a relatively small town in a convenient area. The drive took a total of 9 hours, so it was late when I arrived at the Airbnb. The house was on a street with several other townhouses. When I found it, I parked on the street and brought my things to the door. The house looked decent from the outside, definitely not new, but nothing I wasn't prepared for. I sent the owner a message to let him know I had arrived, as I couldn't find a code for the door in my emails. I waited a few minutes, just standing there looking at the street. Then I heard a nearby door open, and a man came around the corner with a smile. He greeted me as the Airbnb host and let me into the house, saying he was right next door if I needed anything. I hadn't expected that, but he left quickly and didn't do anything too strange. I arranged my things in the bedroom, looked around the house, and then soon went to bed. The next day, I ate a quick breakfast, drove to a hiking trail, and hiked for about 4 hours. I returned to the townhouse at 7 p.m., but as I entered, something felt different. Some things in my room were moved, as if they had been slightly shifted. Nothing I knew was missing, but somehow I had the feeling that something was wrong with them, as if they had been tampered with. Apart from my unfounded suspicions, however, there was no further evidence that anyone had been in the house during my absence. After checking for 30 minutes, I was sure that this was just my nervousness from staying in a strange area. I forgot about it and warmed up a pre-made meal, ate it on the sofa, and watched YouTube on my phone. At 3:20 a.m., I went to bed. It was a single-story townhouse, so the bedroom was at the end of the hallway, opposite the front door. I was used to sleeping upstairs, so it was a bit difficult to relax. As I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I kept falling asleep for a few minutes, then waking up and repeating this process for maybe an hour. After midnight, I was lying awake in bed, waiting to fall back asleep, when I heard something from outside, a door quietly opening from the other side of the house. It sounded deliberate, as if someone was trying to open it as quietly as possible. I sat up in bed and looked at the door while listening, but heard nothing more. After a minute, I got up and went to the bedroom door, opening it just a crack to look down the hallway. I could see the faint light from the porch illuminating the area in front of the front door, indicating that the front door was partially open. I carefully and quietly closed the door and locked it, then went to the back of the room and quietly called the police. During the call, I heard scratching directly outside the bedroom door, and when I looked down, I could see the outline of a shadow standing there. I immediately stopped speaking and waited for them to leave before continuing to report to the operator. Fortunately, nothing else seemed to happen while I waited for the officer. They were gone by then, but everything indicated that someone had been in the house, including footprints everywhere. There was no doubt, even for the police, but although I somehow had it in my mind that it could have been the Airbnb host, they found nothing to support that, apart from the front door being open without any signs of a struggle. There's also not much to say about whether they had been in the house during the day while I was away, as nothing was missing, and they only came back when I was there. I think their intentions had something to do with me. It still haunts me what could have happened and whether they are still out there, continuing to try. Last New Year's, my two best friends and I decided it would be fun to get together and rent a house for the night. We weren't into big parties, but enjoyed being together in a small group. Plus, we all lived in dorm rooms, so having a house to ourselves, even without partying, sounded like a great time. My friend Jason rented an Airbnb on the outskirts of town. I drove with my other friend Christian, and we met Jason there on New Year's Eve afternoon. The house was more of a cabin than a regular house, built entirely of wood and with typical cabin features. There were other similar cabins in the area, but they were all far enough apart that it felt like we were alone here. The interior wasn't particularly great, but it was one of the cheaper options, so we weren't expecting luxury. We spent the day sitting in the living room talking, and around 6 p.m., Christian quickly went to the store to get snacks and drinks. During this time, Jason and I were still sitting in the living room when there was suddenly a knock on the door. We looked at each other in surprise, as it was really strange for someone to be knocking on the door of an Airbnb cabin here. I got up and looked through the peephole and saw a guy on the doorstep. I noticed the door had a metal latch, so I engaged it and opened the door just enough to see him. Normally, I wouldn't open the door to a strange guy, but since I was in a rented house, I wasn't sure if he might be the host or something. The guy looked at me, and I immediately realized he was disgruntled. He seemed upset about something, and that became even clearer when he opened his mouth. He said in a disrespectful and stubborn tone that we had to be quiet tonight and shouldn't disturb the whole neighborhood. The way he said it sounded almost threatening, as if we had already made noise. But we hadn't done anything loud yet and had no intention of doing so. All the houses were so far apart that even if he was a neighbor, he couldn't possibly hear us unless we were setting off rockets or something. I didn't feel like arguing with him, so I just said, "Okay," and closed the door in his face. But no sooner had I closed the door than he knocked loudly again. I ignored him this time and made a face at Jason as if this guy was crazy. We heard him leave after a while, and when Christian came back, we told him about the encounter, and he almost didn't believe us. The next 3 hours passed quickly while we watched a movie and played some games on Jason's Switch. Just before midnight, we suddenly heard something outside. It sounded like someone dropped something on the ground, and a few seconds later, we heard the piercing sound of breaking glass right outside the door. We jumped up and ran to the window to look outside. There stood the exact same guy from before, this time next to Christian's car, whose windshield was now covered in glass. The guy was holding a metal baseball bat and seemed to be walking around in a psychotic state, going crazy. Christian was furious and stormed to the door to confront him. Both Jason and I tried to stop him, but even before we reached the door frame, a gunshot echoed through the cabin. I stood frozen, knowing exactly what had probably happened, but it was almost like a miracle when I saw Christian sprint back into the house and lock the door behind him. A few more shots echoed through the cabin, hitting the wall, followed by the man hitting the front door with the baseball bat. Then, just as suddenly as it all began, the man just ran off. After an investigation, it turned out that he wasn't even a neighbor of the Airbnb. No one knows who he was, where he came from, or why he suddenly completely freaked out. It was just an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable encounter that almost cost us our lives. I travel often, sometimes with friends and family, but often alone. Some people find it strange, but it's one of my favorite activities. Seeing new places, doing new things, trying new foods, and meeting new people, that sort of thing. This time I was visiting Miami Beach, Florida, and rented an Airbnb nearby. It wasn't anything particularly expensive or large. It was pretty small, but it was okay. It wasn't extraordinary, but okay. It definitely wasn't the cleanest or freshest like in the pictures, but it was okay. I'm not particularly picky and normally a very relaxed and understanding person. It bothered me a little, but I quickly forgot about it. In fact, I even did a little cleaning when I got there because I have a bit of OCD and like things neat and clean. Everything was completely normal. I spent the day walking on the beach, visiting local shops, and I went to an Italian restaurant that I really liked. It was a normal day, nothing unusual. Before I went to bed, I always liked to read. It helps me relax, and besides, I just love to read. It was like any other night. The only difference was that I was in a different area. I heard a strange beeping sound while I was just about to fall asleep. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was loud enough to catch my attention and trigger my fight-or-flight instinct for a brief moment. When I woke up, I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It started beeping again, about every 15 to 20 seconds. I thought it might be the smoke detector, because sometimes a smoke detector beeps when the batteries are low or something is wrong, and the beeping doesn't stop until it gets the attention it needs. So I went into the living room to look for the smoke detector. I quickly realized that the sound definitely wasn't coming from the smoke detector because I still heard it and now knew it wasn't from there. I realized the sound was definitely coming from the bedroom. It was very quiet, so I stayed still to listen exactly where it was coming from. As I got closer, it only took a few more beeps until I discovered what was soon the creepiest and most disturbing thing that had ever happened to me. A tiny caramel-colored object peeking through the wall in the upper left corner of the bedroom. It must have been installed in the wall somehow. I don't know, but I immediately panicked and left the bedroom. I went into the kitchen and started pacing. I began to worry seriously that there might be more cameras in the house. I searched everywhere for more and found 3 more, one in the living room, and I'm serious, there were 2 more in the bathroom, one pointed at the shower and one pointed at the shower from outside. I felt so violated. I couldn't stay there a second longer. I called my mother and cried, then I called my husband. They told me to leave immediately. I packed my things and left the Airbnb as quickly as possible. I was afraid that the person who had hidden the cameras there would see that I had discovered them and that they would try to do something to me before I could leave. I stayed in a nearby motel for the rest of the night and fell asleep on FaceTime with my husband. The next morning, I drove straight home. I called the police, and when they arrived, they said there were no cameras, but they found holes twice as large in the places where I had explained the cameras were. However, the person responsible appeared before the police so they could destroy the evidence. The charges were dropped because I couldn't prove anything. I wish I had taken pictures, but I was in such a panic that I didn't even think about it until it was too late. When I was at university, I was on the wrestling team. Normally, we always traveled in small groups, but this time I had to travel alone, so I booked an Airbnb for myself. It wasn't my first choice, but it was either that or I wouldn't have made it to my tournament on time. I met the host in the small one-room loft where I was staying. He was a man, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s, quite tall and had thinning hair. He showed me the apartment and honestly seemed quite nice. Shortly after, he left the apartment and I was just getting settled. I didn't do much except order some food and watch TV, as I had a long day ahead of me the next day and wanted to make sure I got enough sleep. It was about 10:30 p.m. when I was getting ready for bed when I heard strange noises from outside and then someone talking. I couldn't quite make out what was being said, as it sounded very muffled. I didn't think much of it and forgot about it a few minutes later. I left the room where I was going to sleep to get some water and go to the bathroom before going to bed. When I left the bathroom, I heard someone talking again, but this time the voice was closer. I was a bit worried, so I went into the living room to investigate. When I went there, I noticed that the doorknob was being turned back and forth. There were no other doors in the loft, so the only way out was a window if I needed to escape quickly. Had someone broken in, I panicked. I had to make a quick decision. I went back into the bedroom to think about what to do. I stayed there for a few minutes, and for a brief moment it was silent, so I slowly crept back into the living room to see what was going on. I peeked around the corner and saw that the door was wide open. I didn't know if that meant he was somewhere in the house or if he was coming back. But I didn't care. I really didn't want to find out. I saw it as my cue to escape. I crawled through one of the back windows and jumped over a fence into a dingy, dimly lit alley. I found a safe place to call the police. When they arrived, no one was to be found. There were no signs of a break-in whatsoever, and the front door was closed. Literally nothing had been stolen, no damage, nothing unusual. When I told the host about the incident, he acted strangely. He didn't seem nearly as concerned as he should have been. I found that extremely strange and a huge red flag, especially since no one had taken anything and the door was closed when the police arrived. I called my friend, who offered to let me stay with him in his motel room. I had to sleep on the floor, but fortunately, he had lent me a sleeping bag, which was better than nothing. I will never use Airbnb again.